Welcome back to the Gentleman's Gazette and part 2 of our steak guide. Today we talk about how to buy a great steak. The first step to buying a great steak is to look at the components we discussed in part 1 of our steak guide, which you can watch here. First, we're going to determine the right cut, whether it's a ribeye, a tenderloin, a New York strip, a sirloin, or a porterhouse, or maybe a T-bone steak. Second, you look at the flavor profile. Is it grass-fed? Is it grain-fed? Or maybe grain-fed with grass finish? Of course, the size and the thickness of the steak are also very important. In most grocery stores, steaks are usually cut very thinly, while most chefs prefer a 1 to 2 inch thickness. At the end of the day, you should choose something that you're comfortable cooking because both can be over and undercooked. In my experience, I prefer slightly thicker cut steaks because I like the nice pink areas inside the steak when I cook it medium rare. A huge factor to consider when buying a steak is the amount of marbling, which is basically the amount of intramuscular fat. The marbling of steak can vary considerably depending on the cut you choose, as well as the quality level of beef that you get. In the United States, the USDA has a grading system for beef that's pretty universal. Basically, you have 3 main USDA categories. There's USDA Select, USDA Choice, and USDA Prime. These 3 grading categories are simply based on the amount of marbling present in the beef. USDA Select is considered to be the lowest grade of steak you can get, but it's also the leanest one. Take a look at the strip steak. There's hardly any fat, and 40% of all steaks are categorized as USDA Select. The next class up is USDA Choice. Just take a look at this New York strip steak. It has visually more marbling. That's exactly what you want. Fine marbling, not big chunks of fat, because they won't melt when you grill or sear the steak. Choice is the only category that is subcategorized into 3. You have small marbling, moderate marbling, and modest marbling. So there's small marbling, which is 37% of all steaks. There is modest marbling, which is 15% of all steaks. And then there is moderate marbling, which is 5% of all steaks. On top of the USDA scale throws the prime steak. It's the most flavorful choice with the largest amount of marbling. Only about 3% of all steaks are graded as USDA Prime. Just take a look at this strip steak. It visually has more marbling than the other 2, and it's also the most expensive one, coming in at $23.99 a pound at the local grocery store. So what about grass-fed beef, you might wonder? Grass-fed beef is actually not a protected term, and so it can mean anything from a cow that ate just a tiny bit of grass to one that ate nothing but grass at all. So because of that, it really pays to understand where your grass-fed beef is coming from and what the breeders are actually doing and feeding to their cattle. In general, grass-fed beef is leaner and has less intramuscular fat simply because grass is not as energy dense as grain. Also, grazing cows walk more than grain-fed cows. In recent years, grass-fed beef has become a lot more popular. People declare it as the healthy choice because it contains omega-3 fatty acids. Now, while the claim is true, in my opinion, it pales in comparison to other foods. For example, a 3.5 ounce piece of sirloin steak that is grass-fed has about 80 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids. At the same time, a traditional or conventional grain-fed piece of beef of the same size, of the same cut, has about half at 40 milligrams. At the same time, if you compare it to a 3.5 ounce piece of salmon, which contains 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids, that means you get about 12 to 25 as much in the same portion. So yes, while you get more omega-3 fatty acids with grass-fed beef, I suggest you just eat salmon every once in a while and then go with traditional beef and you get a lot more omega-3 overall. That being said, grass-fed cattle are more often treated in a better way, meaning they use less antibiotics. They are not in tight feedlots, but they're grazing, and overall it leads to less pollution for the environment and a less costly way to raise cattle. Personally, I like grass-fed steaks simply for the flavor, which is slightly different, and I don't mind that it's a little leaner and usually not as tender. At the end of the day, it's a personal choice that you have to make, and there's no right or wrong answer. So what about Angus steaks or certified Angus? It's a term that you often see in restaurants or grocery stores, but it is in fact a breed, not a quality grading. Angus or Aberdeen Angus is a breed of Scottish cattle that is smaller than the typical American cattle. Because it is a breed, it can be select, choice, or prime, just like other beef that is non-Angus. Angus has been around in the US for quite a while, and the American Angus Association was founded in Chicago in 1883. Interestingly, it took them until 1978 to come up with the certified Angus beef standard. The purpose behind the certification was to promote the idea of a higher quality beef. To meet the certified Angus standard, the cow must be 51% black and exhibit Angus influence, which includes Simmental cattle and crossbreds. There's also a bunch of other criteria that you have to fulfill, including higher than average marbling, a carcass size of under 1,000 pounds, and a certain hump size. To learn more about the details, please check out our in-depth steak guide on the website here. That being said, it's worth keeping in mind that even McDonald's serves certified Angus beef. In my opinion, most people would not be able to discern a pair of tenderloin certified Angus beef from a tenderloin that is not certified Angus in a blind test. At the same time, I firmly believe that most people will immediately be able to tell a difference between, let's say, a select grade tenderloin and a prime tenderloin. So what about Kobe beef or Japanese beef? Is it worth your money? So first of all, what is Kobe beef or Wagyu? It is a Japanese black cattle breed and a substrain of that that's called TAJIMA. It is fed on grain fodder, and the feeding period is usually a lot longer than in the US. Typically 26 to 32 months, whereas in the US it's only 18 months. It also has a much higher content of intramuscular fat, and the melting point of the fat is a lot lower, so when you eat it, it melts in your mouth like butter. Per year, there are only about 3,000 cattle that qualify as authentic Kobe beef, and the best of them are never exported from Japan. Kobe grades go from A1 at the low end to A5 at the highest end. In the US, there's only a handful of restaurants that even offer A5 grade Kobe beef. Anything else is not the real deal, and it's a crossbreed between the TAJIMA strain and maybe Angus cattle or other cattle in the US. So whenever you are at the grocery store in the US and you see something advertised as Kobe beef, know that it's not the real thing. If you are at restaurants and it is the real thing, it will cost you anywhere from $40 to $60 per ounce to enjoy such a steak. Basically, that's almost $2 a gram. A few years back, I saw it for sale at Harrods in London, but it still cost about half as much at about $1 a gram or over $1,000 a kilo. In my experience, Kobe beef is so fatty that you really don't need more than 2 or 3 ounces. I once had it when I was in Japan, and it's an entirely different experience from an American steak in my opinion. I wouldn't even call it the same thing. It's just something on its own, and it's really like flavorful butter rather than the steak experience that you're used to. So should you buy the American Wagyu or Kobe beef that is advertised all over the place? Well, just keep in mind that it's a crossbreed typically between Angus cattle and the TAJIMA cattle, and that usually results in a higher amount of fat content, but again, it's not regulated, and so you really don't know what you get unless you can trust the source. There are in fact some American-style Kobe beef breeders who have not crossbred their cattle, and they have them DNA tested to have them certified by the WAGYU Association. In general, I would urge you not to overpay for American-style Kobe beef, especially when you're in restaurants, because you can never see the raw product. Another Japanese beef variety that has become more popular recently in the US is the so-called Akaushi beef. It's actually a form of Japanese red cattle, not black cattle, and in 1994, a Texas ranger imported 11 purebred Akaushi cattle to the US. He kept them separate, so he prevented crossbreeding, and today they have over 5,000 cattle. Typically, the Akaushi steaks have even more marbling than prime steaks, and you can take a closer look here where you can clearly see prime, akaushi, and choice. Clear difference in marbling. Personally, I like the taste of it, and I think it's a good alternative. It's typically priced a little higher than prime, but sometimes it's on sale and you get it for even less than prime. So next time you come across an akaushi piece of beef, maybe give it a try and see if you like it. So how do you know whether a steak is aged so it's really tender? I always find that if I use my finger and I push into the meat and the meat stays down, it is tender and it's going to be a tender steak once it's cooked or grilled. Typically, grocery store steaks are not aged as long, and if you push on it, you can see it bounces right back out at you. Now, a tenderloin will probably always stay in, versus something like a sirloin will pop back out at you unless it's aged for quite a while. Now, of course, once you know what cut of beef you like and what type of beef you like, you have to decide where you're gonna buy it. Typically, the lowest quality steak is always pre-cut at the grocery store and shrink wrapped. You have to hope that they didn't cheat on the packaging date, but keep in mind that aging beef is not necessarily a bad thing as long as it's not spoiled. Alternatively, you can have your piece of meat cut at the meat counter, which has the big advantage that you can get exactly the piece of meat you want in the exact thickness. Personally, I like my steaks a little thicker, so I always prefer to have them cut just for me. Another great source for your steaks is the local butcher shop. Sometimes there are chains, and then it's harder to know where things are coming from. If you go to an independently owned butcher, they can usually tell exactly where their cattle is coming from and what breed it is and why they chose it. Best of all, you can even have them dry age certain beef cuts to order just for you. So it's a service that I really enjoy. That aside, we sometimes also buy meat from the farmer's market because there I know exactly who the farmer is. He has it processed at a butcher shop and I know that all the money I'm paying goes to him and not to some marketing or logistics scheme. When it comes to specialty steaks, especially for American style Wagyu or very high-end steaks that are very expensive, you can also buy them online. They come to you in styrofoam boxes in dried ice, so they're frozen, but you don't have to worry, they don't spoil or anything, and you can buy there with confidence. That being said, I've always found that the price you pay for that kind of service is quite high for what you get, so personally, I prefer to buy my meat locally. At the end of the day, what kind of steak you buy is entirely up to you. If you go to the grocery store, you'll likely get the best price. If you go to your farmer or butcher, you will probably learn more about where your meat is coming from and what you're eating. It's also worth noting that cattle that is stressed out before it's being slaughtered will have meat that tastes different and is tougher than meat from a cattle that was relaxed by the time it was killed. Also, if you like the taste of dry-aged beef, you typically will have to go to a butcher shop or someone who really knows how to handle it. Otherwise, you simply won't be able to get it. And it's not something you can do in your fridge at home. I once tried it years ago and I failed miserably. So what kind of steaks do I like? I prefer dry-aged steaks that are about 3 to 4 weeks dry-aged. In terms of cuts, I like the ribeye, the New York strip, and the tenderloin. Typically, I try to get a prime grade or more because I eat beef very, very rarely. But if I do, I want to splurge on it and really enjoy the experience with the best flavor possible. That being said, my dad's from Brazil, and in Brazil they eat churrasco, which is a really big steak with coarse salt that is grass-fed and usually flame grilled, and it's quite delicious. Now, once you've selected the right steak, there are many different ways to prepare it. You can grill it over a gas grill or a charcoal grill. You can use a pan searing method, you can do it in the oven. And to learn more about how to prepare the perfect steak, what options you have, and what may be best for you, please check out part 3 of our series here. In today's video, I'm wearing a typical steak grilling outfit consisting of a blue polo shirt with long seersucker pants and Sperry boat shoes in navy and burgundy.